In this lecture, we will establish a framework for studying U.S. history from the Civil War onwards, focusing on four central themes: mission and manifest destiny, industrialization, imperialism, and race. We cannot understand U.S. history without taking into consideration the concept of mission. This notion traces back to the Christian Church's formative years, emphasizing the spread of the gospel. Mission became a hallmark of European identity, particularly during the Middle Ages. During this period, Europe was less developed than other regions like China, India, or even West Africa. Nevertheless, they were convinced of a God-given obligation to spread what they considered their superior civilization, Christianity. By 1900, this once less prominent region had remarkably transformed into the center of global power, a shift we will explore throughout this course. Originally, the mission was religious. The Spanish, for instance, brought Christianity to America, intertwining their pursuit of wealth with religious evangelization. This pattern of religious and economic motives also characterized British colonization in North America. While British investors sought to reap profits from the tobacco plantations in Virginia, the Pilgrims sought to create a model Christian society, a city upon a hill in New England. The Enlightenment marked a significant shift. It brought about a questioning of traditional Christian doctrines and the authority of the Church. The American Revolution reflects this Enlightenment spirit, founding a nation on principles of democracy, secularism, and capitalism. These elements formed the foundation of classical liberalism, or liberty, in our course's context. This new mission was no longer about spreading religious beliefs, but promoting Enlightenment ideals of governance and society. Essentially, America's mission was, and in many ways continues to be, spreading and defending liberty. Manifest destiny initially symbolized an inevitable global shift towards governance models like that of the United States. However, during the Mexican-American War, it took on a more aggressive tone, suggesting a divine right to territorial expansion. This shift reflected both idealistic aspirations and pragmatic justifications for territorial acquisition, such as the case of California during the Gold Rush. The idea that manifest destiny can be stated as America's God-given right to overspread the continent is an oversimplification. Industrialization, the transformation from agrarian to manufacturing economies, began in England in the late 18th century and spread to the U.S. in the early 19th century. This period saw the North industrialize rapidly, while the South remained predominantly agrarian. The diverging economic paths contributed to tensions leading to the Civil War. After the war, the industrialized North and the agrarian South faced distinct economic challenges, with the South becoming a resource provider for the North. By the 20th century, the U.S. had emerged as a leading industrial power, a status that became widely recognized after World War I. The U.S. did not build a vast overseas empire in less developed areas, as did European powers, notably Britain and France. The main reason for this is that the U.S. had access to all of the resources it needed on the North American continent. It didn't need to build an empire because it already had one. In the late 19th century, when the U.S. did begin overseas expansion, it predominantly practiced a form of economic imperialism, influencing other nations' economies without direct governmental control. This imperialism was driven by industry and supported by the mission of spreading civilization and enlightenment. In U.S. history, the concepts of race and privilege are deeply intertwined and complex. We need to distinguish between racism and bigotry. Racism in the American context has often been based on the presupposition of inherent, unchangeable defects attributed to certain racial groups, most notably African Americans. This form of discrimination is rooted in the belief in an inherent inferiority based on immutable biological characteristics, such as skin color. Such beliefs have historically led to systemic and enduring forms of discrimination and inequality. In contrast, bigotry, while also a form of discrimination, is generally based on cultural, religious, or social differences that are perceived as changeable. For example, Irish Americans faced significant bigotry in the past, largely due to religious and cultural differences. Over time, as these immigrant groups assimilated and their religious and cultural differences became less pronounced or deemed less significant in the broader society, they were able to overcome much of the ostracization they initially faced. We must note the distinction between racism and bigotry in exploring the historical and contemporary dynamics of race and privilege in the United States. The formula whiteness equals privilege applies, but only if we acknowledge that bigotry has racial overtones. At the height of Irish immigration, discrimination against them leads some today to suggest they were not white, but were able to become white. As they became white, they were able to exercise privilege they were prevented from before. In contrast, because of their skin, Black people can never become white. So under the formula whiteness equals privilege, they would always be excluded. The civil rights movement and subsequent legislative changes legally ended this distinction and replaced it with the idea of equal opportunity. It is no longer legal to practice any form of segregation based on race, however you define it. But racism is deeply embedded in American society, so it continues to pose significant challenges. These themes will accompany us throughout the course. We will begin with a look at industrialization in the next module. Please proceed to answer the questions in the assignment on Canvas. If you have any questions, you can post them in the open forum discussion or contact the professor using Canvas email.